meeting of the Fairfield Board of Education is called to order. The date is August 24th. I'm the chair, Christine Vitale, and I'm joined by Mr. Rotelli, Ms. Jacobson, Ms. Pitko, Mrs. Gerber, Superintendent Cummings, Mr. Asa, Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly, Mr. Peterson, and Ms. Guernsey. I ask you all to please rise for the pledge. Fogging up. The purpose of the special meeting is largely to review the COVID-19 policies that the board passed last year. At the end of June, we forwarded the expiration date on those policies to today. They previously were scheduled to sunset on June 30th, but we knew that some of the guidance might be changing, as well as just situation on the ground in terms of the pandemic. So that is the primary reason of the meeting tonight. If any members of the public would like to speak to agenda items, I invite you to come up and state your name and address for the record. Seeing none in the room. Marco, are you on the line? Do we have any call-in public comment that we need to take regarding the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we will move forward. Just a reminder to the public, if anyone wants to give comment on agenda items, you are welcome to submit comment via the public comment form that is on the Board of Ed's website, as well as emailing to the public comment email address. And with that, I will yield the floor to Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly, chair of our policy committee, just to kind of talk us through where we are. Actually, I'll put it through. Thank you, Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly. Approval of policies. The recommended motion, the Board of Education approve policies. Waive the reading. Any objection to waiving the reading? Seeing none.
When do you want to have the motion to separate them?
We can do it right now.
Okay.
Let's put the first motion on. So you want to put the motion on the table?
Yep, I'll vote.
Second, Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly.
I'd like to make a motion to take each one of these policies on its own motion, please.
Can I have a second for that? Ms. Rotelli, seek the unanimous consent of the board just to take these as separate vote for each policy. Seeing no objection, okay, we'll move on. So we'll start with policy C19.1, temporary policies and regulations. I'm going to yield the floor to Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly to talk us through these.
Okay, so you did receive a new draft of this at the table right here. For members of the public at home, it was just misplaced wording with the word regulations and requirements. It drops lower in the paragraph for anyone who's looking at this language. For the sake of the board, the primary emphasis here is on moving the date to be consistent with the current executive order so that these policies, so all of the COVID policies are guided by the effective date here, which would be moved to September 30th to be no longer a factor as of October 1st. And that is C19.1.
Mr. Peterson.
If I can ask a broader question, it appears that several of these policies have no changes. And in those cases, I guess maybe this is a question for our chair, will we need, if we're voting on them separately, will we need to vote on them at all? If the controlling one is the C19.1 that changes the sunset date for all the policies. I guess, Ms. Maxon-Kennelly, am I correct that several of these have no changes to them?
Only, I think there might be two that have no changes, because two that had no changes we're going to be requesting to delete. And the others had some minor.
They're minor.
That said, I don't know the answer to Mr. Peterson's questions. We addressed each separately in policy, but
Ms. Deasy could come up.
Oh,
We can, I think, address this.
Good evening, I'm Colleen Deasy, I'm the Executive Director of Personnel and Legal Services. There are 3 policies where there are no changes recommended at this time from the Policy Committee. The first one is C-19-2, C-19-4, and C-19-10. So, Mr. Peterson, you're correct that if we don't vote on them, they would remain as is under C-19-1.
Thank you.
So therefore, I don't know if they have to be strict, I don't know how to handle that procedurally, since we've now separated them all, so when we get to them, do we just skip it? But that said, on the table before us now is C 19.1.
let's just move forward with C 19.1. Any questions about C 19.1? Any member of the public like to give comment on C 19.1? Mr. Peterson, do you have a comment?
I have a comment. There's a weird line break in the last paragraph on the second page of this. Right after the board or the line break, administration is appropriate. I'm sorry, that's what I do.
If you look on the cleaned up version, which was enclosure number 1, that doesn't appear on the cleaned up version. It's only, I believe, because of the formatting involved in the strike through and additional language.
I don't know. Apologies.
Any other comments?
I would suggest that the board is always looking at the one that has red language on it, because that indicates changes. The one that's in solid black ink is because that's what the policy will look like and how it reads if we approve it.
Before we proceed, hold on, Mrs. Gerber, in dividing the question, a motion to put this policy separately on the table. My error in terms of putting for discussion, being that we divided it, now we're going to vote to move policy C1, C19-1 forward. So can I have a motion to move that forward? Mrs. Maxon-Cannelli, Ms. Guernsey. Thank you, Mrs. Gerber, for that point of order. Officially on the table.
So I understand the reasoning behind extending this through September 30th, but just a question or clarification maybe for the chair. I'm assuming that, or for the policy chair, that there will be work commencing in the coming weeks as to what ifs if some of this from the state level expires and it's on us. So is that something that we will be discussing in advance at future meetings prior to September 30th as to what some of the potential policies, or are we just going to have to wait until this expires and have a limbo time between the two?
I'm trying to see, what
Well,
are the,
I would put this back. You know, the policy committee should be reviewing these committees, and the board and board leadership should be reviewing these committees as new information comes out in terms of state guidance. And I think that as it progresses over the coming weeks, that will be a decision whether or not it needs to go to the policy committee first, or if it should be before the full board.
Okay.
As an agenda item.
Okay, because my only concern is that, like with a lot from the state, we don't get much, and that on the last days of September, all of a sudden they tell us, okay, this is being extended, or it's on the districts, And are we going to go through a process to have policies ready to go for various scenarios?
I think it's a little bit difficult for me to answer that question right now in terms of I cannot predict the future in terms of what scenarios we would be preparing for. I think that we should let school start and see what the first week of school brings, and as we get more information and we see how it progresses, we will take it from there.
Okay, I
I mean,
think
the
that,
conversation will be ongoing, but planning a policy for a hypothetical right now,
okay, I just want to put it out there that, to make sure that this is on our agendas and, discussing it, because this policy, 19.1, gives broader flexibility to both the administration and the board to make changes to policies, whereas for the first time, we may be faced with something like a mask policy if the state mandate expires and they throw it on us. So I just, in the past year, the board was less involved with that process. So I just want to make sure that in the coming weeks, we get the pulse of the board on where they want to be on this.
absolutely, and I think that those conversations will be happening as they always do during our regular meeting, and we can definitely, put that on the policy committee's agenda just to be monitoring these C-19 policies, realizing that this one is going to expire in a month and a couple weeks, and we need to be prepared for that, either to have new policies to replace them or change the date again on this. So this will be coming back before the board quite in some form, quite possibly in the coming months.
And I'd say that obviously the wild card here is the timing of any direction that we receive, because we do have a policy meeting on Tuesday, the 31st, and then due to the holidays, we don't have another one. We only have one in the month of September, which is on the 21st. So if something comes out, again, I'll just say it as a timing issue, whereas there'll at least be 3 board meetings with the 31st, the 14th, and the 28th. So that will have an impact on, is it going straight to the board and policy doesn't even get a chance to tackle it? We just don't know yet, but so I leave that to our board leadership in crafting the agenda.
And if need be, we will hold a special meeting for just this topic in the coming weeks as we learn more.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Asa, any other questions about this policy? Any other questions for the board? Back to the public. Any comment? Okay, take it to the board for a vote. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Can I have a motion to put C-19-2, health and safety regulations?
So are we not going to do that now? 19.2
Just-
has no changes.
I mean, could we just, any reason why we can't just vote on it, being that it's on the agenda as a motion? So I think that we would have to have a motion to withdraw it. Seeing no changes, can I have a motion to Mrs. Gerber, a second? Ms. Maxinelli, any discussion? All in favor? Moving this forward? Yep.
Sorry, this is another one, and I just want to point out that this is a specific subsection of this 19 policy that I think, again, will need to be looked at and discussed at future meetings in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Asa. To the public for any comment? All in favor? Vote again, motion carries 9-0. Policy 19.4 and 3524.2, green cleaning program. Can I have a motion to put this on the table? Mrs. Gerber, seconded by Ms. Jacobson.
Again, this one had no changes.
Okay, any comment? Seeing no changes, back to the public. Any comment? Seeing none, back to the board for a vote. All in favor? Motion. Policy C19.5 and 35.15, community use on school facilities. Mrs. Maxinelli, can I have a second? Ms. Guernsey?
So for this policy, you'll see that if you go to the second page with the yellow, that had been our existing COVID policy. You have to flip to the back where you will see the insertion of red language. That one of the topics that dominated the policy committee discussion was the need for consistency at each level with these policies and not wanting one story out of one school, another story out of a different school. And again, we understood that that was all part of sorting out last year, but now we thought that this was an important addition to the policy to indicate the importance of this. And so that was the only language change made to this policy, 19.5.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Asa?
So thank you for adding that to the policy committee in a consistent manner. I think that's very important because one thing that we saw over the last year was inconsistencies at buildings, both at within levels and by levels. So, for example, you might have 2 elementary schools doing one thing, 2 doing the other, same thing at middle school. So I think it's important to have that in there. It is something, obviously, that's going to have to be monitored by, I guess, central office to make sure that the buildings are complying. And I would just ask that close eyes are put on that. With regard to the building use community, to Mrs. Maxinelli, am I correct in that this would also cover PTA use of the buildings? This section? I know there's a couple.
I actually did not, certainly not for during school PTA meeting time.
I'm talking about after hours.
We talked about that, and we actually then went and looked for PTA language in the other policies. And unfortunately, the PTA, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. I'm actually not positive of the answer to that question.
Okay, so my point here is that from what I understand, the PTAs have been told that they need to present individual proposals for any event at the school, and maybe Mr. Papa George can confirm that for us. And I would like to know exactly what kind of information are you looking for and what kind of information are you using to base your decisions on whether a school may use the property for such PTA events that happen early in the year, such as walkathons and other welcoming back, things. Obviously, I'm assuming a lot of PTAs for Welcome Back Bash and family things are going to be outside, but I would like some clarification on what kind of criteria is being used to approve or deny. And I see Mr. Cleary and Jill here from the Health Department, and would also like to know if we're consulting with them on these decisions or if we're just making them.
Mr. Cummings, before we go through to, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to comment on that first, and through you to whoever you feel best to answer that.
Yeah, I got to Mr. Papa George come up just to answer Mr. Ace's questions. I think in general, and we actually met on this today to revise the form, and he could speak to the details that we're asking for in that form. But essentially, PTA, other building uses of the form, such as recreation, basketball, those types of things, we're looking to open the buildings back up for after-school activities and evening activities. Essentially, what we're saying is that those activities are going to abide by the same types of social distancing requirements and things that the school day holds. As a school facility, people have to essentially agree to that. So large events like you discussed, certainly a walkathon is going to take place outside anyway, but other types of things we would encourage people, while the weather's still good, to go outside. And I'm going to make this comment multiple times tonight, and it kind of speaks back to, Mr. Asa, to your earlier questions about the sunsetting of policies or the potential revision of policies. Our expectation or hope is that as the health data trends more positively in the good direction, that we'll be able to further open up the schools and make other changes, because our goal has always been, bring back the community in the schools we know are a focal point for that. So that's where we want to bring our work. So, Mr. Papageorge, could you speak to the essentially as when people apply or look for a building use form, whether it's PTA or anybody else, the kind of process that we engage in?
So we're using two different processes right now. The first one being outside groups, such as the PAL basketball or Parks and Rec, that type of thing. We are using our school dude reservation system. So it's going through the normal approval process. Once they, and those are for activities, as I mentioned, that are outside of school hours, evening hours, weekends, that type of stuff. Once they put in the application and we are able to approve it, we send them back just a short list of things that say they're responsible to meet COVID restrictions and be aware of the policies and procedures that are in place, and they need to follow them, such as masks inside the buildings, those type of things. So that's the basic information. We're just giving them the basic information and telling them they're responsible to maintain and be responsible for adhering to the rules and regulations of the building, which is no change. It's just that there's more rules and regulations at this time than normal. As for PTA events or school events, we've added two. We're asking them to also go through the school dude process, but we've added to that is a form that is automatically generated and sent to them. It's asking for more information just because we feel that they're during school hour events. So we're looking at how many people, what the requirements are going to be, if it's an inside event, outside event, if there's food being served. Those are the types of questions being asked during those interview process, I should say, or form. And then the form is automatically sent off to the principal, signs off on it, then it comes to central office to the executive director for that school group, and then it comes over to my office for the final approval, and then we move it along from there.
So you say that it goes to the principal for sign-off. If the central office and your office and whoever else is involved is signing off on this, is there any reason to expect that one building administrator who may be more cautious than another would have the ability to not allow an event at one school, but it be allowed at another? Like, what are we doing as a stopgap safety issue to make sure that we have equity across all the schools?
I can address that because that's the conversations we've had with the building administrators last week during the advance. And essentially, it's giving them the guidance that we're looking for ways to open the buildings up as much as possible. And to the principal's support, in the subsequent week, there's a couple of things that they have worked on to make possible that they initially weren't thinking could be possible. So people are trying to get creative in addressing these issues. I also will say, just to add to Mr. Papageorge, I'm hoping, I reached out today to PTA Council, but it was late in the day, I've not heard back, but I'm hoping to set up a meeting with them next week with the PTA presidents to go over this in a meeting format to kind of answer their questions and talk about where we are and where we want to be.
I thank you for that, and I think that would be very, very beneficial. So thank you, Mr. Cummings.
Any other questions? Ms. Jacobson.
Thank you. So when we were in policy committee meeting and we were talking about this policy, I think this is one that kind of bothers me a little bit in terms of extending it, because for many of the reasons that Mr. Asa brought up, that it has seemed to cause inequities in our system, not to mention a further loss of engagement for our students and our families that I think is problematic at this time. I think, not to go back to Mr. Asa's point, but the authority in this policy to deny or to limit, to restrict the language that's in here is granted solely to the superintendent, and it is not granted to any building administrator, which hopefully will help the situation. But if we're going to keep this policy and align it with the current state guidance that came out, the AAA document that just came out, it really was specific to external groups, as Mr. Papageorge was mentioning, and not other groups, so to speak, who I don't know who that is. But I think that we could probably clean this up a little bit to make it better for, guidance in terms of what we're looking for to be more allowable and adapted versus denial. And I'd like to see us to do that, and I don't, we can have a conversation about that, but the spirit in which we made this change on the consistency language was to be consistent in the allowable sense, not consistent in the denying sense. So I just want to share that context at this meeting, because not everyone was there, and that, we could be in this situation for a really long time. And I'm hoping that this year we're looking towards allowing and adapting versus denying.
I can speak to that.
Mr. Cummings?
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Jacobson. I will say to you, based on the experience that we engaged in the spring, after March, the principals, I don't know of any situation where a principal denied something. I know of quite a number of situations where the principal approved something, and then when it came to central office, we had questions about it. And then we went back and we worked with the principals. A couple of times we had conversations with the health department, with Ms. Mitchell and Mr. Cleary, in ways to make the desired event happen. Now, at that time, we were not talking about outside activities. We were really talking about a lot of school-based activities. And the principals, in some cases, were very anxious to bring things kind of back to normal. And so we might have, as a modification, taken an event and split it in half. So there was half a number of people in the building, in the event, but still everybody could participate. Those are the types of things we did. So this was not I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that this is simply a bureaucratic process in which we wait for the rubber stamp. There's a lot of back and forth and conversation and engagement with both the building administrators, the central office administrators, because everybody was trying to figure out a way how to make these things happen. I very much appreciate what you're saying, and if there's a way to capture that in language, we should. But I just want people to know that the spirit of the staff is to make things happen when we can make things happen. And if we can't make it quite happen the way people would like it to happen the first shot, then we have to modify it, but we'll still make it happen. So that's the experience we had in the spring.
Thank you for that. So just specific to this policy, we're not talking about student events. So we're not talking about prom. We're not talking about chess club. That is not in this policy.
Yeah, I recognize that, but and I apologize if it wasn't clear. We're going to convey is that initiative that our building and central office administrators have to make things happen is not limited to one type of event or another. I think that very much is what we want to be able to accomplish, because we know how important those events are to the kids and to their families.
Right, and so what I'm saying is that they are separated because they're not a part of this policy. This is for external community groups. This is not for student-based groups, because one of my amendments was to say non-student, non-parent community groups, to make it clear that we're not talking about things that are student-run at our schools, like the leadership club at a middle school, like a service club at the middle school, like any clubs or after-school activities we have at our high schools. Those are not covered in this policy. So we don't have a policy to restrict those, other than the general mitigation strategies that we have in place at this time. So my hope is that we don't see that happening this year like we did last year, like, oh, they have to go virtual, or they can't meet, or we can't have the activity meeting, or we can't, that just all needs to come back as far as I'm concerned, utilizing the mitigation strategies though. So just to be clear, this is about external groups only.
Thank you. I understand that, but I think that we can bring that same approach forward to external. I will tell you though, and this is a pre-pandemic issue, the school system has always had expectations for external groups in using fields or facilities. And I think you probably have some familiarity that for the most part, there is a lot of compliance and people go above and beyond. Occasionally we have people who don't. So we want to be, anything we do going forward, we want to be able to still bring that same ability to say no to some folks because of their inability to abide.
General standards. So we're just talking about this C19 thing, right? So, I mean, that's oh, that doesn't change the underlying policy. But I just also want to make sure that, for Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts and that kind of thing, that's going to be allowable, right? Because if we let anyone in, we're going to allow those to go forward this year.
I didn't hear the last part, I'm sorry.
Scouts and Girl Scouts are going to be allowed to, if somebody wants to run their troops this year, they're going to be allowed to do that.
The last paragraph explicitly references Boy Scouts, et cetera. So
Right.
there's no been power vested in this policy to disallow that.
Well, it's an external group.
It's in the policy language. We did not strike it temporarily as part of this policy. So at least the groups you just indicated are explicitly referenced in
Excluded.
policy as allowed use.
Okay, all right, just wanted to make sure that those weren't being applied to this. All right, so that's just what I have to say about that. I mean, if we don't want to leave it the way that it is, that's fine, and we understand that what we're all hoping for here is a lot more activity at our schools, within the guidelines, preferably outdoors, preferably after school, right, as the guidance says. Thank you.
Any other comments on community use of school facilities policy? Seeing none, take it to the public. Any comments on this policy? Seeing none, back to the board. Oh.
Katie Flynn, 204 Grandview Road. I made public comment on this policy at the committee meeting. I just want to say thank you to the entire board and Mr. Cummings for reiterating the importance of our external communities, our PTAs, our Girl Scouts, our Boy Scouts. It was a hard year last year, inside of school, outside of school, for our families, and I can say as a PTA president, the excitement we are seeing talking about walkathons, talking about the first day of school is overwhelming. So thank you all. We appreciate it.
Thank you. And before we go to the board for a vote, I hear that we have one caller, member of the public that is called in that is now able to give comments. So I'm just going to allow that person to give comment now prior to the vote, just in case their comment has to do with this. So if you're on the line and you can hear, please give your name and address for the record and give your comment. Can you just announce that, Mr.?
Yes, I understand the caller is Lisa Yao. Marco, if you could unmute her.
Give us a second. The joys of, hybrid meetings. Okay. All right, Mr. Asa, while we're trying to work that out, oh, they're talking and we can't hear them. Does anyone in the audience possibly know why we might not be able to hear them? Staff I'm talking to. Of course, if we have any tech guys that might have, we'll take any assistance we can. Right, I apologize to that person if you can hear us. I'm sorry that we can't hear you. Ask you just to please submit your public comment to the public comment email address. It is being recorded. And if you are on and we resolve this technical difficulty, we'll try to make room later in the meeting. Okay, so back to the board for a vote. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Can I have a motion to move forward?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, I'm gonna switch her back on.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Lisa Yo. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me?
We can
Okay.
now,
I know
yes.
there's some technical difficulties tonight. So I apologize. I can't really hear you, but I will try this again. Basically, I wanted to bring up the issue of special needs and high-risk families who need online learning. Can you still hear me?
We can still hear you.
Okay, great. We have a rising junior at Fairfield Ward High School. He has autism, he has an IEP, but he cannot return because the oncologist tells him he cannot return. His brother has 3 organ transplants, and he also has cancer. So not only is our family struggling to fight cancer, but we are also struggling to continue online schooling because our rising junior in high school cannot return to school. It is an issue when, there are towns like New Canaan and Waterbury who are offering online schooling in Connecticut, but Fairfield does not. And I'm asking the community for support. I'm asking our community and our neighbors for understanding, because we are still in lockdown. We can't go anywhere if no one is vaccinated. If there are people who are not getting vaccinated and not wearing masks, we cannot ask our son to go back into a school. Our doctors are telling our son not to go back into a school because there are still people who are not vaccinated. Yes, my son is vaccinated, but it's 42% effectiveness against the Delta variant. You understand? And I have 2 friends who just contracted COVID, and they both had their vaccine. They're both vaccinated. So for high-risk families, we need some support from the town, from our community, and from our schools for online learning.
Thank you. Marco, is there any other caller on the line?
No, the other caller did not call in.
Okay, thank you. All right. Moving to policy C19-6 and 2550 visits to the schools. Can I have a motion for this forward? Mrs. Maxcanelli, a second. Mrs. Gerber?
Whoops. This policy, again, if you go to the last page, except not the AR, those are the administrative regs. So it's essentially the 3rd page where you'll see, again, the language in red, where to be consistent, which this is something we did not catch the first time around, that it said board and it should have said superintendent. And again, the emphasis in the policy discussion was on being in the consistent administration of this policy by level. So other than that, this again, our discussion also included the idea of how much we hope this can get increasingly opened. I'm sure it might not be that way on day one as we sort ourselves out, but that idea of, again, the return to normal as much as is possible was certainly part of our policy discussion.
Thank you, Mrs. Maxcanelli. And I agree that, our top priority on day one is to get all of our students back 5 days a week, all day, but we absolutely want to, open up our schools to our parents and other, outside groups that utilize our buildings. So any questions or comments on this policy? Ms. Guernsey?
I just have something really quick that I'm noticing about, we had struck the adapted advanced achieve legal reference. Do we want to replace that with the fall 2021 reference, or are we just deleting that? I'm not sure the answer to that.
I already have a note to speak with Ms. Deasy about the citations in general across them. We started discussing that at the policy meeting, and we were probably in the weeds more than we needed to. We raised the issue, but I'm going to be following up with Ms. Deasy to make sure that these citations are all set.
Thanks so much.
Any other questions from Ms. Mascanelli or Mr. Cummings? Mr. Asa?
Yeah, so with regard to visitations, I was pleased to receive an email today that parents were going to be allowed for kindergarten and certain levels and new parents to district and schools. And I was just wondering if that could just be confirmed, is that district-wide and hopefully not just an individual school basis?
I don't know, Dr. Zavachanza, could you speak to that?
Good evening, James Evajancic, Executive Director of Instruction, Curriculum, and Assessment. I can confirm that, so all kindergarten parents and guardians, first grade, since they didn't have the opportunity last year, and new families in our K-5 schools will be allowed an opportunity to visit the school at some point, either this week or within the first 2 weeks of school. On Friday, all elementary schools are doing orientations with students only as well. K through 5, whether they were in the school or not.
Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. So Friday is orientation for all K-5 students only with each of the 11 elementary school buildings. There will be a separate orientation/visit to the school for parents and students either this week or within the first 2 weeks of school, but everybody will be doing one, all 11 buildings. They just may not be on the same day.
Can I ask a question? This might be a dumb question, but why would we have kindergartners visit the school after school has started with their parents?
Kindergartners are visiting on Friday before school begins. Parents can visit with their kindergartners as well within this week or the weeks after. So there would be 2 visits, one with and one without.
Okay, so that does raise an equity issue for me because, for example, in my school, on Thursday, we're going to be able to go with our kindergartner to their classroom. But you're saying at other elementary schools, the kindergartners might be able to get in, but the parents of the K-1 and new students may not be able to get in until the following week.
That is accurate, yes.
And what is the reasoning for that and not keeping it consistent?
So
because this is something that we've heard for the last year or more about outrage at the lack of consistency. So I understand there's logistical hurdles, but why does one school do it differently this week than another?
We wanted to make sure for the schools that had not sent out the ability to visit as well, give parents enough time for planning in addition to come to the school versus 2 days. So it gives them up to 2 weeks notice in order to join. And this is first grade as well and new families.
Mr. Cummings? Okay. And then
I'm sorry. What I hear you saying, Dr. Zavachanzik, is some of the, maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the schools had this plan this week. Others did not. So in order to provide this equal opportunity, the schools that were planning it are going ahead, but the other schools will now do it, but give time for the other families. For those schools who hadn't planned it, they're going to plan it in order to give a week or out in order to give families time to make the arrangements because it's going to be after school. Is that correct?
That is accurate, yes.
Okay,
They're
so,
all going to be after
can
school.
Can I interrupt here then?
Yeah.
Because how is it possible that schools could have planned to let parents into the building this week? Some schools could have planned it before today when seemingly a change came. How could they have planned it? Because when emails went out last week about visitation, it was very clear that no parents are allowed in the building. But now we're saying that some schools were actually planning to let parents in the building, which again underlines the equity issue of the schools and why were some schools allowed to plan for that and others weren't?
They, I'll answer this one. They were not allowed to plan for it. So when we became aware of the fact that there was this inconsistent practice, the principals identified this as an issue. Some of the principals identified this as an issue, and Dr. Savachinsik met with them this morning to get them on the same page in what they could offer the families. But to the concerns of the board, it was, this is the issue that we're working with them that they can't do.
Hence this policy being revised. Ms. Massacanelli.
And what I was hearing, I might be incorrect about, but for the ones that had not been planning on it, is it that they are giving their parents the option? In other words, that they may come in this Friday, but if they had not made plans accordingly, that they will have a second opportunity. Obviously, they're only getting one opportunity, but that will all 11 be able to do it this Thursday or Friday? But if a parent had not made work allowances, babysitting coverage, if they're not able to make it Thursday or Friday, they will have a second opportunity.
So for students, all of them can come in on Friday, and some are doing Thursday. So I would say that's inaccurate in that because there's so many families, or students, I should say, coming in on Friday, because it's all K through 5, there were concerns with how many people would be in the building at once. So the parents are not coming. They'll be with the students, obviously. They won't be in the building unless it's one of the larger rooms where we could social distance them.
So they're not visiting the classrooms?
On Friday, they would not be. They would be visiting during the parent visitation time set by the school. So there's 2 different visit times, one for just students and one for students and parents.
Mrs. Mascanelli.
So I guess my follow-up to this is that I would say as a first day, as a first stumble and a first usage of this policy, that right now what I'm hearing is completely at odds with what this policy is looking for. I understand it as a first day stumble as principals are getting their schools ready, but my hope would be that this is the last time that it happens, that they have to be consistent. They have to be, so that those schools where they're coming in on Thursday and Friday, this policy indicates that they will all be coming in Thursday and Friday, period. And that however they have to be, the schedule has to be allocated, however the times need to be broken up, however the staggering needs to be done, because I absolutely hear, I mean, some of our kindergartens are right at 23, some are significantly smaller, and having all of those bodies in the classroom at one time, I am entirely empathetic that that is a logistical nightmare, and we will have to schedule for it. But the issue of having parents with their kindergartners in that classroom is obviously a very emotional one, and it's not quite the chord that we want to be striking, and that this policy is requesting of staff. So I would just say that going forward, this is what I really hope we don't hear any more of.
I still have a major issue with this. I have a major issue with this, and I understand what Mrs. Mascanelli is saying, but the bottom line is you're going to be violating the policy that we're about to pass. So why can't certain principals make it work when others can? I understand that there's logistical problems, but we've been in a pandemic for over a year. No, don't let me finish, please. We've been in a pandemic for almost over a year. And there has to be a way. Our principals have done an outstanding job, and they've been able to adapt, and they've been able to move mountains to get things done. I give them all the credit in the world. But now I say that we need to call them to make this equitable and make it consistent so that whether you go to North Stratfield, Sherman, Riverfield, Jennings, or any of the 11 elementary schools, you will get the same introduction to the school this year as the other ones.
Mr. Asa, I was going to let you continue, just trying to just take the heat down just a little bit. Keep the discourse civil, and I appreciate the passions run high. Mr. Cummings, I don't know if you have anything to respond to that. I want to bring us back to just the language of the policy, if we can.
I would only respond with, I understand, Mr. Asa, I do understand, and this is, when this issue came up and rose to our attention, we addressed it. I appreciate what you just said about the efforts of the principals. I think that in working to address this, there are, and I don't put this forward as an excuse by any means. I think you know me enough to know that this is not an excuse. I think what I want to say, though, is that the different issues around buildings, even just the size of buildings, as Ms. Maxon-Canelli pointed out, the different sizes within classrooms as they can fluctuate within a grade level, all play issues in the principal's decision. Just a side note related to this, as we were talking about this yesterday, Dr. Zavachansik and I, and how we might be able to approach this, buildings that have an exit door directly out of the building allowed for a flow, but not all of our buildings have that. So those are things that the buildings are trying to work through as they process this. And as Dr. Zavachansik said, because the consistency was not there from the beginning, as it should have been, and when we discovered it, it was pulled together, but we're also trying to work with being fair to parents about getting them aware, because the opportunity for parents to visit the school may impose on other schedules. So we were just trying to give them a fair warning on that.
Can I just follow up to that, and just one more ask, Dr. Zavajanska and Mr. Cummings. We're a year away from next year, and incoming kindergartners, it's middle school, high school, everything. One thing I would ask is that when parents are invited, that we consider the working parents, because there are a lot of them in this district, and that we try and start having principals plan now to be able to have these visitations early in the morning so that they can get to work. Because having them in the middle of the day, and I understand there's PD and everything, so there's a lot that goes into planning it, and I understand that and respect that. So I just ask that for next year, when we get there, and I'm just throwing it in here, I know it's out of this policy, but we're on this topic, that we take those working parents into account a little bit better than we have in the past.
It's been recognized as a need and put on the agenda for early winter to plan for next year by the principals already.
Oh, sorry. Any other questions about this policy? Thank you, Dr. Zavajanzik. Any public comment before we take to the board for a vote? Seeing none, all in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Moving on, motion to put policy C19.7 and 1212 school volunteers. The motion? Mrs. Maxon-Canelli, a second. Mrs. Gerber?
So for this policy, again, I ask that you turn to the last page to again see the familiar language in red, so that this is otherwise the same policy previously approved, but now with the added language regarding the consistent manner by level in terms of the application of decisions to restrict.
Any questions? Mr. Asa?
Yes. With regard to the volunteers, I know I've reached out to Mr. Cummings and had a discussion with this, and I respect his explanation on here. But one thing I would want to say is I totally understand why we don't want tons of people in the building, and I wouldn't advocate for that right now. But things that I'm thinking of are like the one parent a day or two parents a day that goes and helps the librarian, that is very easily able to keep their distance from anybody, especially students. So I guess my question is, if we could, get some clarity on this, what is the hope or anticipated date that we might be shooting for to resume some of those things that I just mentioned?
A number of things that we would be looking at, I mean, the review period, to my mind, is tied to the end of the month and to actually the dates on the policies. I think in this case, around the issues around volunteers, to your point, one or two people in the library is not an open house. But I think the other issue that we have to get more clarity on from the state is the issues around vaccinations requirements, because if volunteers have to have those vaccinations like school personnel do, then we're going to have to, I want to make sure that when we invite people to be volunteers, they're aware of that and they agree to that before they come in. So my hope is, on the DPH call this morning, we were told there should be an FAQ on the vaccinations within 2 or 3 days. And I hope those are actual days and not state days. So as soon as we have it, we will share that with the community.
Okay, so if we don't get that information, then that's something that we'll be discussing with the health department and internal staff on how to manage how we're going to do that. So if we're asking all of our staff to be educated, and the state doesn't give any guidance on volunteers in the building, then we're going to have to deal with that on our own.
Yes, we'll have to seek some type of opinion and get some other thoughts. And then, as we do usually with that, we'll seek other legal opinion, and we'll also, Ms. Mitchell in the past has been terrific in asking other communities from the health department perspective, and I reach out to the superintendents. So we get some benchmarking.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Any other questions on this policy? Okay, seeing none, we'll take to the public. Any public comment? Back to the board. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Can I have a motion to move policy C19.8 and 5113, attendance, excuses, dismissal? Ms. Maxicanelli, second by Ms. Guernsey.
Okay, so for this policy, if you, again, go to the back pages, this is a fat one. This was not a case of language addition, but of subtraction. So you'll see the strike through. And happy to take any questions.
Ms. Jacobson?
This is a really important policy because this is the only place that, because since our board does not have a policy on what's happening with kids who are in quarantine and isolation, this is the policy that it rests in. There's going to be an update later in this meeting on remote learning and quarantine. And so I'm asking the chair if we can have that information now prior to this board voting on this policy, or hold this until after we get that information.
We can table the voting of this policy until the end of the meeting?
Just my request.
Just to get through the votes on this. And also, Mr. Cummings, if you want to present now.
I'd be happy to share the information I have, absolutely.
Okay, then we'll just take on, is there any objection of suspending the rules and just going out of order on the agenda? Seeing none. Mr. Cummings?
So, Ms. Jacobson, do you have a specific question, or do you have questions around how those students in either quarantine or longer-term remote learning absences will be counted?
I can clarify. I have a bunch on this. Right now on our website, it says, as of this moment, that kids are just going to get a packet upon return, so that's what's on our website. But we do have an update later in the meeting, so I want to know what that is, because in this policy, it says that kids who are out on COVID-related items, which I think we're going to need to clarify what that means, will be participating from home. And when we passed this policy originally on 9/8/20, that meant live streaming into their classroom. That's how this board passed this policy. So if it's anything different than that, then we should know that before we vote on the policy and understand what we're passing before we pass it.
For the sake of the board, the specific language being referenced is at the bottom of page C. So, Mrs. Jacobson, if I'm correct, the nature of your question is regarding that word participate, what that looks like.
Yes, also, it's a substantial change. And just, we're doing a lot of, I just want to say, we're doing a lot of policies out of how we normally do policy on this board. Normally we have like the first read and there's time and all that. Because of the nature of this thing, we're having to do these one and dones. And so there were some changes at the meeting that we didn't have ahead of time. So you are substantially changing this by taking out the word non, right? That's a very massive change to this policy for a very little word. And then, I think we need to clarify what COVID-related means in this policy, because someone could say, well, I have the sniffles and it's, I don't want to go into school because I'm being told due to COVID, I shouldn't do that. So do you know what I'm saying? Like, this is very ambiguous right now. It is a massive policy in terms of its implications. So I just feel like we should take some time to really understand what we're voting on as it in today's terms versus how we originally passed it in 9/8. So my question is, yes. What does participate from home mean exactly? And I'm sure you have it all in your update. So just what that is, and then we can take it from there in terms of the policy.
Okay. So we are, this is the update, and I want to be clear that this is where we are right now, and we're in the process of continuing this work. And I want to separate out, for purposes of this conversation, the quarantine-type short-term absences from the longer-term absences that are related to, in reference particularly to our caller this evening, as well as some of the other cases where either students or family members have medical issues that prevent attendance in schools, the more long-term absence. We are working on solutions that would provide ongoing support to students in both situations. In the short-term absences, and actually I should say in the long term, that might look slightly different by level. And by level I mean either a K-5 approach or a 612 approach. In the short-term absences, what we're looking at right now is providing students work related to the curriculum that they are, their grade level curriculum on pacing guide, and then additional instructional support. We are in the process of moving to hire support staff, long-term subs to support students with that work in a virtual manner. So that they would be, essentially, the way we're looking at this is the student would be able to get learning support from teachers related to the work that was assigned to them from school. Participation then would be the participation in being part of the virtual support, completing the work. Participation is essentially engaging in the work that's assigned to you. There's an assumption here, let me just take one step back. There's an assumption here in the conversation that I'm having, the scenarios I'm presenting, that students are able to actually do the work, that they're not, because we've got kids who could be potentially in quarantine. We also have students who may be positive but asymptomatic and able to do the work. And then we're going to have students who are sick and not able to do work, right? Those would be sick days. But if you're participating in the work, if you're putting in the effort, then you're going to be in attendance at school. And at the 612 level, we're looking at a couple of different situations that would involve students, being able to use Google Classrooms, access instruction, and or additional direct support from the teachers, all of that delivered virtually. What we're not, I want to be clear, what we're not talking about at this point is a live streaming scenario. We're talking about either prepped lessons in advance or recorded lessons after the fact to support the students, as well as the ability to interface with the teachers with questions. And again, the participation is that you're doing the work and you're seeking help when you need it, reaching out to the teacher, those types of things. The long term, we are looking at how we can support those students with because again, everything there would be online. This may involve, I would say fairly safely, that this is going to involve different solutions for different kids, dependent on the types of services they may be entitled to. There could be a way of providing homebound tutoring, additional, we may look at the idea of supporting them with current staff on a stipended basis to provide additional supports. We also are looking at, for those students, providing some type of counseling support, given the isolation that they're going to be in. And, you know, it was more difficult. It was difficult last year, but now, because the numbers of students who require this have drastically reduced, we feel we have to do even more of that. So that's kind of the overview where we are now. And we're moving to, like I said, to hire the people, to put the plans in place. Both Mr. Mancusi and I are reaching out to parents tomorrow to specifically talk about some of their cases, and begin to move forward on how to put these specific things in place for them.
Ms. Guernsey.
I have a lot of questions, but I'm not sure that can be answered. But what I do have a question about for the quarantine, which hopefully you can answer, is related to the timeline. I mean, the plans that you're describing seem really individualized, and I'm just wondering what would be the expectation if someone receives notification that they need to be in quarantine because of COVID. What would the expectation be when they would start receiving this kind of at-home instruction? Maybe that's, anyway.
Well, one of the things, thank you, that's a good question. And one of the things that we're working off of this approach in some ways is anchoring it, in what was an approach when students were out prior to COVID, right? So if a student was going to be out for 5 or 6 days because of an illness, how would a school system respond? How would a teacher respond? Given that length of time, it usually takes a day for teachers to put together a set of materials, put books together, whatever it might be expected to support the students. So we're thinking that, particularly maybe more at the elementary than at the secondary, it may take 24 hours to kind of turn things around for the student. But I think even then, a lot will depend on for all levels, a lot will depend on the time of day notification comes in that a student is in quarantine or a student is, tested positive but is asymptomatic. If we've got a notification in the morning, we can spend that school day responding. If the notification comes in later in the evening and school staff don't pick it up to that evening or in the morning, then we're behind in a sense. But our desire is to turn that around as quickly as possible. I also think that, and again, the unknown is how many students this is going to involve. So I caution on my next statement, but I also think that with some experience, we'll be able to pick that up. I also believe that with experience, we're going to better vary our approaches in order to meet individual student and family needs. So one of the things that we're thinking about with hiring long-term subs, for example, to support students is that we may be able to vary their hours to better meet the needs of families and have that support available more when families might be available to also be on the line with the students. So those are things we're trying to work out, but there's going to be a learning curve, and then it's going to be kind of a constant shifting as students move in and out of quarantine. So those are pieces we're working on.
Ms. Guernsey, any other questions?
No, thank you.
Mr. Cummings, can you share just why the live stream isn't just automatically happening, or the concerns that you might have around just having students live streaming into the classroom?
Yes, I can. The concerns with the live streaming and this is part of our ongoing conversations, but the concerns with live streaming come from the difficulties it presents to staff. I think I understand it. People will say, just turn the cameras on and let it be. But I think it's very difficult for a teacher to just turn the camera on and then not be conscious of the fact that there's a student on the camera and not pay attention to them. And it's really based on the experiences we had last year when, despite all the efforts of staff, it was very difficult to provide strong instruction to both the students in front of you and the students at home at the same time. We are hopeful, particularly at the secondary level, that with the ability for students to be vaccinated and for the quarantine distance, the distancing now being less, that we'll have fewer students that actually have to go into quarantine. And therefore, we're hopeful that, and also the fact that the quarantine period is shortened. So we believe that the measures that we're looking at to implement are appropriate to the length of absence that a student has. If you think about it, if a student's on a 5-day quarantine, they might miss, they're going to miss 2 or 3 of their high school classes during that time. The solutions we're looking at should provide those students that level of support, at the same time continue to support the students who are able to maintain time in school. The secondary level also has a greater familiarity facility with the Google Classroom, which better supports students. At the elementary level, the dual learning, both the trying to do live streaming and in class with the younger students presented even greater challenges, and we don't think it's for the students in class. It detracts from their instruction, but also for the students who are at home. What we're trying to be conscious of is not having them sit in front of that computer for so long. As we talked about this idea of turning the camera on and just letting the camera be, the students are essentially watching TV. And the level of engagement, I think, will vary, but it will all depend on what's on the TV. And I think for a lot of kids, that's not going to lead to the best instruction. I think we can do a better job teaching kids if we can connect the in-class material and expectations to a person who's dedicated to servicing those kids in a virtual learning support format.
Mr. Telly.
Thank you. You kind of touched on what my question was going to be about live streaming, because we spent a lot of money on technology last year so that we could live stream, and now we're hearing the difficulties for the staff, which I understand, but we're not really talking about the difficulties for the students who are going to be missing instruction. And I heard you say that it's going to be difficult to provide strong instruction, but essentially we're just not going to provide any. We're going to get a Google link or a Google Meet and a pre-recorded assignment instead of potentially, especially in what I imagine would be really difficult to miss, an upper level AP class where a building sub is not going to be able to give instruction to a student who's home for an extended period of time. That live instruction would be available, maybe not in all cases, but in specific cases, so those kids could tune into the class even if they're not participating. I understand the not wanting kids to watch TV, a screen all day, because I saw that all last year, but and the negative effects that has. But in the same token, some of these students should be able to access these classes, and we certainly have the ability to do it if they could just listen to what their teacher was saying.
Ms. Vitale, thank you. I think there was I may be miscommunicated. On the upper, for 612 students, we're looking at the idea of additional support, but the primary primary instructor would remain the classroom teachers. So a student, I think you said an upper level AP class, the student would either have access to some type of recorded or pre-recorded lesson, but they would continue to have access to the teacher for questions. We've talked with staff about the possibility of running extended office hours, how we might be able to do that, and support teachers in that time. So that there's still a connection to the classroom teacher that we would maintain during this period.
I appreciate it, but it's so frustrating to hear this. And, personally having experienced kids having access to teachers and getting questions answered that never went the way it was supposed to go. So there are so many problems I see with this going into school. It's just extremely frustrating that we don't have a complete picture of what's going to happen for our kids.
Mrs. Maxinelli, followed by Mr. Asa.
A couple of things about that. First, my question through the chair to Mr. Cummings. If a teacher at his or her discretion decided it was easier, less cumbersome, less time-consuming, less taxing in any way to just turn the camera on, would that be an option to that teacher?
Yes.
So I appreciate that might be something that a teacher opts to do. That said, I think one thing that is really important that it be reiterated for the public is we just talked about two groups there and we ignored a third group. And that's the group that is the dominant population. We talked about how this will be tasking teachers. We've referenced the impact on the student who is at home quarantining, for whom we do want to keep that connection. But the overwhelming number, as of now, God willing, remains the overwhelming number, is I cannot stress enough how negatively impacted instructionally the in-person students are if a teacher has a live obligation to students at home. It simply no longer becomes the same course. The possibility of maintaining the normal pacing guide for whatever that is impossible. And I say this as somebody who lived it for a year. What I will say is that to parents at home or students at home who said, but it went so well last year, my teacher really made it work. Kudos to that teacher and congratulations to our staff for making something appear effortless that was incredibly time-consuming to pull off. And for those who had a less positive experience because they didn't feel overly connected, it's really hard to do. And I think it's important to remember that the vast majority of our students will be in person, and I don't want them getting gypped either. So obviously the fact that I am incredibly appreciative of the fact that quarantine will be vastly reduced due to the new guidelines on that, so that I'm hoping this impacts far, far fewer students. And I do appreciate that we've moved away from purely a packet at home and that there is going to be far more support for our students. But to expect that they're going to get the same experiences as the kids in person is unrealistic, and if it became the expectation of exactly the same experience, you are radically negatively affecting all of those in-person students. And I personally would not be in favor of that either. So we need to support the students, but I'm no longer willing to take the sacrifice that will be asked of our in-person students. So I did want to raise that point. And then I had a third question, and this was something that did not occur to me in policy, and so I apologize for bringing this up now. But to this language at the bottom of page C, Mr. Cummings, would it make sense to be more specific if we said if a student is unable to attend class in person due to quarantine? Because I will admit, the idea of right now, while in the midst of the pandemic, opening the floodgates to this vague COVID-related reasons, I am getting the heebie-jeebies like you don't want to know about. Because, my day before leaving for vacation, I have a COVID-related reason to want to remote into my room, an access of teachers. And I just see that opening up a Pandora's box of nightmares. And that I think, to be specific with due to quarantine And if it turns out that later we do need to adjust that language, we could always bring it up again. But I would prefer that specificity, and again, I'm very apologetic that this did not occur to me in policy. So I don't know if anyone needs to sit and ruminate on that one, but I put that to you, Mr. Cummings.
Well, I'll start. I can, I know others are ruminating. I think if you only put quarantine in there are going to be students also who in isolation, that may be asymptomatic, that could still engage in class. So if it's a and or an or, I suppose, I hear what you're saying about COVID-related being broader, but I think that there's potentially two groups of students that that are still going to want to participate in school if they can.
So due to quarantine or school mandated, health department mandated isolation, I wouldn't be correct to the terminology on that.
I like the inclusion of the word health department isolation or health department mandated quarantine, because.
Excuse me, health department mandated quarantine and or isolation?
Yes.
Okay, so I will be making that as a motion, but I just want to let the conversation continue. I'll come back to that. If there's none.
First of all, I'm sorry, but this is August 24th. We are starting schools on Monday. And we don't have a document for our parents to tell them what's happening if their kid has to go into quarantine or isolation. Why is this happening? I mean, how can this be happening now? We're going to have to fix this in policy because this is so late. Why wasn't this done in like July? We don't have a plan. 7:30 in the morning
Cummings?
on Monday morning, we have no plan.
Ms. Jacobs said, I recognize that, but I will tell you that as I think we've tried to maintain communication with the board all summer. The lack of clarity, first of all, the legislation, and then and as we work through that process, essentially the message being you shouldn't do anything. Then the message changing to, well, you should do something. And then essentially, for all intents and purposes, the communication coming to a stop from the state. And the frustration that we feel in that, and it's compounded by the fact that while they were talking, the statement was you're going to get more information. So you're kind of waiting because we've, as you know, have been turned around before by trying to do something and get ahead of it and then having the world change around us. So you're kind of waiting. And then you realize slowly, and maybe too slowly, that the fact that nothing is coming means nothing is coming at all. And that we're going to let you figure it out. And now you're left with, okay, how are we going to put this together? Because, and now every district, once again, is doing what they can, operating independently with the resources they have, and at the last minute to try to pull some of these things together. The lack of direction, the lack of support, the lack of clear communication. It was only today on the DPH call where one of the attendees asked one of the State Department representatives around this issue of remote learning, broadly speaking, both kinds, right? And we heard clear as day, essentially, well, you do what you got to do. I had a personal phone call with this same person 2 weeks ago who told me you're going to get more guidance because I was raising these exact same questions 2 weeks ago. So I know sounds like I'm making excuses, but this is the truth of where we are. I think every day, the executive directors, myself, have had these conversations, kind of what to do. It seems like we don't care about these parents and their kids, and that's absolutely not the truth. That's absolutely not the case. The stories, the conversations we've had with these families, it's heart-rending, because you know that they want to be in school, but they can't. And the lack of support and clear direction, or quite honestly, if they had just said 3 weeks ago, you're on your own, to figure it out, we would have. So I apologize to the board, I apologize to the families about this, and I apologize for the lateness in this. I apologize to our staff. But we're going to fix it, and I want to be really clear. Where we are on Monday is not where we're going to wind up. We're asking for people's patience, but we're going to move quickly to get this thing fixed, and we're going to learn from what goes well and what doesn't go so well, and we're going to get it fixed. It's not a question of money. We will use the ARP funds to support what we need to do for families and kids. And we will move as quickly as we can.
Thank you. I believe me, understand the frustration with Hartford at this point, because they've, as far as I'm concerned, just chosen to abandon this very children that they're sending out of school. So hopefully we can get that fixed in special session if that happens. In the meantime, I think that I understand Mrs. Maxon Kennelly's point on this. I really do. The reality is it's going to be really hard right now. We can be in this for the next 10 years. We have no idea. And at some point, we're going to have to find a permanent solution on the kids that are being denied access to their education, who are perfectly healthy and doing better than whatever it is I just heard, because I don't know what that is. That is 35 middle school class periods in a week. 35. Then they come in on Monday the next week. Let's just say it's a Monday to a Monday. They have 35 that somehow we think they've made, and then they're coming in. I mean, this, for the upper school kids, that is a lot of work, unless that is done so brilliantly. So my point is, yeah, we have an obligation to everyone that's sitting in the room, but sorry, we do too with the ones that are sitting at home. So if we have to spend all that money, then that's what we need to do. As far as I'm concerned, we cannot leave them isolated for a week at a time from their teachers and their peers. That's just my opinion. You guys want to leave it the way it is? That's up to you. I think we should do better.
Ms. Maxon Kennelly.
Yeah, just through the chair to Ms. Jacobson, I hope you pull back the language of deny access to education, which of course sounds pretty borderline illegal. So
that's what's on our website right now.
With the language that you just heard from our superintendent, we are not denying access to education. They are getting different access to education. They're getting access which isn't as superior as in-person learning. But no board member should be saying we are denying access to education.
Okay, so I can take that back, but at the end of the day, that is what is on our website tonight.
Mrs. Jacobson, you just asked a question through the chair to our superintendent. You just heard a lengthy explanation,
right,
which is not about denying access to education. I think it is irresponsible as a board to throw that into the ether and leave it there.
Well, either
you walk it back or you don't. And if you leave it out there, I just want to say publicly, I reject that language, and I do not think that that is what our staff or our leadership is looking to do.
I meant denying access by coming into the building when they're being put in quarantine, and at the end of the day, I did not hear what is happening. And neither did you. We did not hear what is actually going to happen. I heard what we might do, and we're going to. We don't have a plan, Jen.
Okay, I would disagree that we don't have a plan. I think that what we have heard loud and clear is that it's going to be different at different levels, in different courses, with different means from our teachers, but that our students will be supported, that they will have opportunity for synchronous support, that they will have access to the materials.
Just a different opinion.
And we're allowed to have difference of opinions. But I, again, to Mr. Asa, that I gave him some guidance. I'm going to reiterate it again, just, we don't need to try not to raise our voices. I know that it's coming. It's coming from a good place and just caring deeply about kids on both sides. I do think, Mr. Cummings, just over the next week of giving more clarity on what parents can expect, at least to start the school day would be helpful, the start of the school year. I appreciate that the conversations are happening. And just putting in perspective of how much things have changed in the last 30 days. I mean, this board sat here at the end of June and pretty much thought that we were going to not even have to vote on these policies. That really, this meeting was going to be, you know what, we're not going to need them. It's going to be a 5-minute meeting because pretty much we're not going to have to be dealing with the effects of the pandemic anymore. I sat here, I was so optimistic, the light at the end of the tunnel, and here we are. I'm looking at Mr. Cleary and Mr. Mitchell. I mean, at that point, at the end of June, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the Delta wasn't even in Connecticut, and things have changed so greatly over the last 60 days. So just assume some grace and assume that difference of opinions, that we're all coming from a good place and that kids are at the center of it. Ms. Rotelli's had her hand up, so the floor is hers.
Thanks. I know this is incredibly frustrating for everyone, and I think what we've seen all year, what's extremely frustrating for me, is the complete disconnection between the people who are making the guidance at the state level and what's actually happening in our schools and what we need. And what we keep hearing is, we have to wait, and we're waiting to hear, and we're waiting for someone to tell us what to do, and we're waiting for this, and we're waiting for another 3 days, and then when we'll leave this meeting, and we'll get another email that there's updated guidance, and we'll have to change it then. And when we don't have plans, at some point, everybody, it's our job to advocate for these kids and what they need, and right now, we're going to have to start making the plans and stop waiting for people to tell us what to do and just do what the kids need. And that's my level of frustration with this. I have heard a lot of the state calls, and I've heard a lot of wonderful people advocating for our children, and it's completely ignored. And I am so fed up by it. As with, I'm sure, everybody, the frustration all around, but at some point, we have to go ahead and do what we need to do for our kids.
I'm sorry, Mr. Asa, you had the floor. I forgot about you. Go ahead. I apologize.
I just have a couple questions regarding, because I was very fortunate and didn't have to do the live streaming and everything last year with my kid for the most part, like other parents had to endure most of the school year. So, Mr. Cummings, you mentioned pre-recorded lessons, and I hear what Mrs. Maxon-Cannelli said loud and clear about, and hearing it from an educator I think is important to know what they went through trying to address a live stream child and in person and the differences. But would it ever make sense to record the lesson with the equipment that we had for the day and then let the child view it? I know it's not live interaction, but is that something that we looked at doing with our equipment?
That is one of the options that we're looking at, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, because that to me makes sense. I mean, it's not optimal, but it's better than nothing, and at least the student would be able to watch a recorded version of the day, and the teacher wouldn't have to be, managing between the two methods. But I can't imagine, teachers wanting to have to teach the lesson and then go make a pre-recorded version of it when they can just record what they're teaching once and then provide it to the child via a link.
And this is actually an instructional technique that predates the pandemic, but this idea of the flipped classroom, right, that if I prep the lesson in advance, I film myself doing a 15-minute overview or doing an experiment or whatever it might be with the kids, and then I have them watch it before they come into class, essentially for homework. Then when they come into class, I've taken that part out, and I can spend the 82 minutes where they do the experiment, or we, so that is something that we're looking at as an option. And I think one of the things I said earlier, but I want to make sure, to your point, Mr. Asa, in order to, the flexibility for teachers to approach these missed lessons in different ways better mimics the instruction that's going to take place in the classroom. It's, because teachers will vary their instructional technique from day to day, and there may be different ways that they prepare for the students who are not in class that will better support the student learning.
And I understand and respect that answer, but it does once again bring up the question of teacher A doing it one way, teacher B doing it another way, and parents, contacting the building principal saying, wait a minute, Johnny's getting this consistently and, my kid's not. So I think it's definitely going to have to, like before, have some oversight and consistency throughout, as we've kind of read languaged all night. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you. And then the other question I have, because I am interested in the language changes that both Mrs. Jacobson and Mrs. Kennelly raised here. And I'm assuming this is something that we have to deal with tonight. So I would urge one of them to put forth a motion, hopefully soon, so we could hash this out and get the language changed, because it does seem like there might be some differences of opinions here. But thank you.
Ms. Mascanelli?
So I did want to put forward the motion. Again, this is at the bottom of page C. And my motion is to strike for COVID-19 related reasons, which is acknowledging the already stricken non, by the way, and to substitute in place due to health department mandated quarantine or isolation.
Can I have a second for that motion? Mr. Peterson?
And I believe I've already made the argument for putting that in.
Jen, can you repeat that? Can you read back?
Ms. Jacobson? Mrs. Gerber, did you write it down faster than I did?
I believe so. I'm sorry, Mrs. Maxon-Kennelly, where exactly are we?
So this is at the bottom of page C, the paragraph, the bottom of page C, the paragraph beginning with, if a student is unable to attend class in person.
I'm sorry, where? Page C.
There is a version in our packet that's not correct, the second version, so maybe you're looking at that one.
Okay, yeah, I apologize. There are just too many versions here. Okay. So it's the sentence that's in yellow.
Correct.
Okay.
So
Let me just, okay. So you made the motion for page C, final paragraph, to strike, quote, for COVID-19 related reasons. Wait, I'm sorry. So due to health, wait, and then to replace. So it's to strike for COVID-19 related reasons, correct? And replace with due to health department mandated quarantine or isolation.
Correct.
Okay. Do you want me to read that again? Sorry, it was kind of choppy. Everybody's good? Okay.
Any further discussion on this? Ms. Jacobson?
I want to talk about the absence for a second in that same paragraph. So maybe this is a question for Dr. Parrish. So let's just go back up a little bit. When people were participating from home, even though this says that they're absent in this policy, they really weren't absent from school because they were participating from home for at least half the day. So we weren't marking people absent just because they were in quarantine if they were participating from home, were we?
Zakia Parrish, Executive Director of Operations and Processes. So last school year, we were allowed to mark them as present remote. That has changed for the upcoming school year.
Interesting, because I've seen other districts who are doing that. Are they saying, so are you saying that it would be illegal to do?
We're not able to mark them as present and count it as a presence in school based on the change that happened with the state.
Okay, I won't argue that point. So we're going to count them. So how are we going to treat this? Because it just says absence right now. So I think we need to clarify that, Jen, in terms of, it's not necessarily, are they unexcused absent? Are they excused absent?
Well, the second sentence, the absence will be excused if a parent guardian notifies the school's absentee line. I don't know if you're looking for a.
Well, no, because that was before, it was a non-COVID related reason, so they were just sick. So I think we just need to be clear here what we're expecting. If you're out for for now this new quarantine or isolation, do parents need to call in? First of all. Because this district must know they're in quarantine.
The way this has worked, and Ms. Mitchell can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way this has worked is when the quarantine is initiated as a result of an in-school contact tracing, the school is notified, well, the principals are involved in the contact tracing, so they know who's going to be out for that length of time. And therefore, we're able to count that absence as a quarantine-related absence. Or, for that matter, if somebody's actually is concerned that they are positive, right? We count it as that. When the issue emanates from outside the school, we get, I get the hotline calls that somebody tested positive, and we therefore have to do the contact tracing. But if, let's say, it takes place after an extended period of time out of school and a long weekend or something like that, Ms. Mitchell, I don't know, like, does it? I guess maybe the scenario would be if somebody got if the contact tracing happened outside of school, if it happened at some type of church event or someplace else, are the schools, if other children are involved, are the schools made aware that those people are in quarantine? Okay. I'm sorry, I'm trying to recall this.
What we would do was do the initial contact tracing. We have to go back the 48 hours and then determine if there were any contacts in school or in any social settings. I mean, they go through everything. And if any of those people in social settings are on quarantine, I would get that information, pass it on to the nurse and the principal.
But to be clear from the policy, both the language in the middle of page C and the language at the bottom still stipulates a parent phone call as being a requirement. So if we need to change that language and that we only need the guidance from the health department, I don't know what we need to do here.
I personally, I would still encourage the parents to call. I think it's just the right habit to be involved with.
I agree. This way, parents take responsibility for their child being home. Mr. Asa.
I have a question on how this policy, as reworded with the amendment, would go if the quarantine or isolation was not due to being in school. So what if a kid goes on a trip and gets exposed and is quarantined and it had nothing to do with them being in the school building? Does this policy now then still cover them to be able to be excused and participate?
I would read this that it not only means that they are excused, but they are also then, a teacher would be notified, this is a quarantine student and you need to address their participation in class and being kept up on the material. So that regardless of the source of the quarantining, this policy would be in effect.
Would the administration agree with that?
I would, yes.
Thank you.
Even if it comes not from the health department, because we're specifying here, health department mandated. They go to the hospital because they broke an ankle, they get a COVID test, they're test positive, it goes through the health department. So all things, the health department covers everything in the funnel. Okay, all right.
So if you're quarantined from a health department out of state, they'll contact Fairfield and let you guys know?
That's the goal, but in reality, the numbers are just too high that kind of fell by the wayside early on. I'm just trying to think, it's late, and I'm trying to think of the scenario when we have an outside case and a Fairfield school child is identified as a close contact. Well, I mean, let's face it, it would be the Fairfield Health Department that would, let's say they're in the church. It would still be, I mean, we find out about those cases all the time. The camp, the church, you name it, the restaurant, the hairdresser. And so we would find out about that. They would identify who their close contacts were. And if any of those close contacts were school children, well, then we would notify the school about it. And again, it would be a health department directed quarantine for that person.
Yeah, as a follow-up to that, I would also say that the way I would read health department mandated, that's either proactive or reactive. Either you're in a situation where that is what they would be mandating, or they're the ones who got the first word, and so they're directly mandating. So I think my reading of this would be it would cover either way. And I do think the other thing to keep in mind is that the advantage of, yes, I agree, I think the parents should be kept a part of this. I agree with that. But also the advantage that we still get notified by the health department. Hopefully we get that notification even sooner necessarily than the parent phone call, which means administration knows, can tag the student in attendance accordingly, and the teacher has that much more advanced warning that they need to be prepared for this. So,
Jen, I have to say that doesn't necessarily happen. Usually the parents find out first. I mean, they get the lab reports and what have you. And then the information is uploaded into the state health department database, and it comes down to us.
whichever way it happens. Just communicate. But fair enough, thank you.
Well, I think that raises a good point that Jill just says, though, because if my kid tests positive on a Friday and they don't find out about it, let's say, until a day or two later, and I call the absentee line and say, my kid's in quarantine, it's coming. But no, I think, and I appreciate the answers on that. I just wanted to make sure that we were covering it appropriately.
Any more comments about the amendment? Mr. Cleary?
I have no issues with the insertion of the health department in there. It just comes down to that term mandated, where we are actually just directing a person to quarantine and isolate. We're not issuing an order, an official order for somebody to quarantine or isolate. So it's just we're directing them. The enforcement actually comes through the school system, not allowing that individual to attend school while they're under a direction from the health department to quarantine or isolate.
Through the chair to Mr. Cleary, so would you be recommending that the word mandate should be directed?
I'd be more comfortable with that because we're not issuing an order, so I have the authority to issue a quarantine and isolation order, and at no time during this pandemic have we issued orders for people to quarantine and isolate. So it's more of we're directing them that they should quarantine and isolate.
Okay, so if I can make a motion to amend the amendment to change am I doing it wrong?
Or you could just make a friendly amendment to change the one word.
That's what I was trying to waffle my way to. So yes, if I can make a friendly amendment offer before the board to change the word mandated to directed.
Any objection to that? Okay. Change made. Okay, before we vote on the amendment, any additional public comment about the amendment to the main motion? Seeing none, to the board, we're just voting on the amendment. All in favor? Okay, motion carries back to the main motion as amended. Thank you, Mrs. McAnally. Ms. Jacobson.
I have two proposed amendments. One is on the list, so on page B, where it has the list of excused absences, that H be amended to read quarantine and/or isolation.
Can I have a second to that amendment? Mr. Telly? Mr. Asa?
In the spirit of keeping things consistent, should we not just change that to what we just approved in the previous amendment? So it says Health Department directed quarantine and/or isolation?
This list comes from the State Board of Education, but it doesn't matter to me, however you guys want it to be.
If it comes from the state, why would we change it then?
Well, quarantine is not in the state. We're adding that in here. So quarantine is not a State Board of Education excused absence thing. That's just for this COVID policy.
Okay, so like I said before, in the spirit of keeping it consistent, that would be my recommendation, but I have no issue with the amendment.
The second one that I have is that we passed.
Well, let's just do this one now. Would you accept, Mr. Asa's recommendation friendly amendment to amend that to just the language is consistent in terms of what a quarantine is? It's a health department directed quarantine or isolation?
Sure.
Okay, so seeing any objection to that? No. All right, any discussion to the public on that amendment? Seeing none, back to the board. All in favor of that amendment? Motion carries 9-0. Okay, go ahead, Ms. Jacobson, your next amendment.
And then it's not really an amendment. I don't know how we want to do this, but it's for D, you guys, under chronic absenteeism in April, if you remember that we changed this policy for chronic absenteeism when a district team would be needed by subgroup population.
Are you talking about page D?
I am. So I just wanted to ask or request that the proper changed D be put into the policy when it's posted.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that?
It's not an amendment, it's just to say that D is not right because we passed a new policy for D in April. Remember when we made the district, I'm not asking you to make an amendment. I'm just asking for the proper policy to be inserted into this policy when it's posted.
Okay. Mr. Asa?
No, I just wanted to ask Mrs. Jacobson if she was planning to amend G on the page B next to correspond with what we just did. G at the bottom of B.
Yeah, you can put it there too. Yeah, I can make the motion. And G, the list on the same page, B, where it says quarantine, to just insert the same language as we did above. So, Health Department, you got it, Jess. Yeah, thank you.
Second for that, Mr. Asa. Any objection to that? Take to the public. Any comment on that? No public comment. Back to the board. All in favor of that amendment? Motion carries 9-0. Any other discussion or? Okay, we're back to the main motion as amended. Take it to the public for public comment. Anyone welcome to give comment on the main motion as amended? Seeing none, back to the board. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Moving on, policy C-19.9 and 3541, transportation. Can I have a motion? Ms. Maxcanelli, second. Mr. Asa?
So sorry, I just wanted to, if it's hard for me. So again, the entire first half of the packet, I would skip, go towards the end of the packet. Yes, we're going to do better at how we give these to the board. So not the AR. We're not talking about the administrative regs. So it fourth to last piece of paper. And you'll know that it is the correct paper because on the back side, page B, there is the language in red. And so just as some background here, because there are two changes, the language in red plus the strike through. The first thing we talked through in policy was this possibility of opening up the courtesy rides. And just as a reminder to the board, this was something we actually talked about, Mr. Cummings, you correct me, on either May or June of this past school year, that we were going to have this possibility of opening this up. I will say that at the time I was extremely positive about this possibility because it's something that many members in our community had depended on or certainly hoped very strongly for years. And so that when we had to strike it, that was a real issue for a lot of families. Obviously, they adapted. And so to have this language back, I know that I was very pleased to see it in there and did not raise any objections. I will say that my assumption was that the space available would be not the same type of space available we were talking about pre-COVID, but that there would be, very careful determinations made. So that was the spirit of our moving forward the red language. Then in policy, we raised the idea of striking that last paragraph with the idea that it seemed illogical to be opening up something to space available, even as we are then asking parents to take their kids off the bus. Obviously, some parents may choose to continue to do that, but whether this would be a board or district-directed activity was something that policy raised, and thus the language has the strike-through. And so that's a little bit of the background. I know that there are some board questions and issues with this language, and so I will open it up to others now.
Before I bring it to the board, just for clarification, if this policy passes, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will be offering courtesy rides. It just will enable it as a possibility for the upcoming school year, as right now it is not permitted.
Yes, thank you. It really is the idea of the possibility. We are aware, as Ms. Maxon-Kinley spoke to, we are aware, and the drive to bring this back is because of some of the hardship cases that are out there with families. And it's part of our effort to, re-engage the community and to be supportive wherever we can. So the discretion of this still rests with the transportation department based on the enrollment. Nothing would take place immediately because we usually take some time to settle the number of riders on a bus. We get a sense of that. But I will say that, and if the board, Ms. Vitale, if you wish, Mr. Mancusi and I had a conversation about this today, and I think he can provide some sense of just one type of conversation that's come up and how this ability may be able to support some of our families, if you're so inclined.
Would the board welcome just hearing from Mr. Mancusi, and then we'll bring it to the board for questions? Mr. Mancusi?
Good evening. Rob Mancusi, Executive Director of Special Education and Special Programs. In rare instances, we may get a request from a family who might have a student, a severely disabled student, who does receive special transportation, who then has another student who is entering the school. And if there is room on the special transportation, for the sibling to go, because both parents are working, and in an effort to try to help them out, we do request through transportation, if there is space on a van, is it okay for the sibling of the special ed student to go to school with their disabled sibling? And as long as space is available on the van. And we've granted those on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson, you had your hand up, and then Mr. Asa. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Asa?
Unless
Floor is
Mr.
yours.
Peterson has a question for Mr. Mancusi. Okay, so question for you here, and this may have to go to Mr. Papa George because Mr. Schneider is not here, but I don't believe that's the spirit of this policy. I don't. The spirit of this policy is for people who live within walking distance specified by this policy to request a ride to school when there is space available on the bus. I would argue that the situation that you just described should or could fall within the leeway and discretion of the special education department and the transportation department versus what we're talking about here. So while I absolutely agree with this situation, I think it muddies the discussion a little bit on what the spirit of this policy is. So I would personally support that, you know, even if this policy stayed as it is now without us doing courtesy rides, I don't think anyone with common sense would think that that's not something that we could try to do. And I don't think it would be precluded based on this policy, and I would hope that this past year, if we were able to do it, that we did it. But I just wanted to raise that point before I get to my other questions.
Yeah, point well taken.
Just to follow up on that, Mr. Asa, I just have a concern about that offering the same opportunities to all students, because the sibling of a child who has a disability isn't offered the same rights as that child that has a disability. So while it is a definite, I mean, a student who has a sibling with a disability isn't necessarily afforded transportation simply by being a sibling. If they're within walking distance.
I understand, I disagree.
Okay. Mr. Peterson, did you have a question for Mr. Mancusi? Okay, all right, Mr. Mancusi, thank you. Mr. Peterson, the floor is yours, and then we'll go to Mr. Asa.
Well, just very quickly, I actually had a back and forth today with Mr. Cummings about concerns about possible overcrowding on buses. And I understand the purpose of this. I understand kind of trying to get back to normal. I would encourage you to exercise your discretion as you have it under this and under the administrative reg to not overcrowd buses where necessary, and to keep public health concerns in mind. And that was the thrust of our conversation. I just wanted to put that out on the table.
Mr. Asa, followed by Ms. Jacobson.
Okay, so I have a bunch of points here, and I did send Mr. Cummings an email about this, and Mr. Papa George and Mr. Schneider, and the chair, and also the policy chair. So I just want to touch on a couple things and maybe get some clarifications and answers. So I guess as you can feel what's coming here is I'm opposed to this policy change at this time. We are requiring our children to continue mitigation strategies that we had hoped were going to go away but are still here with us, right? It's a fact. We're talking about keeping kids moving at recess so they're not within 3 feet of each other. Yet in the next breath, we're talking about bringing more kids on buses if there's space available. And I'm not saying that I'm opposed to this, period. I'm opposed to it now. And unless the transportation department can answer a few questions. And one is, what is the current, and this might be a question for Jill and Sands, what is the requirement currently regarding spacing on buses? And do we need to bother with assigned seating, or can we use the cameras on the bus to do the contact tracing?
Sorry. At this time, there is no requirement for a maximum number aside from the usual maximum number that's on the bus. I've spoken to Steve about this, and he feels that the buses are going to be quite full this year.
Okay, so...
Oh, but as far as planned seating is concerned, I've asked him about that and requested it. He feels that he, at this time, first day of school, he would not be able to do that. But once a week or so goes by, so he actually knows who's riding the bus and who isn't, then he would be able to institute the assigned seating.
Okay, and I would agree with that. I think it's going to take a lot more than a week because it's going to take a few weeks. It's going to be into October before we know true ridership, and then that can fluctuate and change. But with regard to the contact tracing, can you just elaborate a little bit on what will go into that? We've heard about it in the school and vaccinated and everything. How does that play into for the buses?
For the buses, we would still be using the 6-foot distancing, 15-minute rule, mask or no mask, but of course on the bus they're going to be wearing a mask. We get a copy of the bus routes whenever there's a positive student on the case. We look at the times that the students are either picked up or dropped off, the distance to school, how much time actually elapsed with the one positive student, and that circle around them.
And for the middle and high school children that are vaccinated, would they fall under those same guidelines as in the school where they'll be exempt from quarantining if
That's
they're
right.
asymptomatic?
That's right. Vaccinated individuals do not need to quarantine as long as they are asymptomatic.
And this, let me just see if I have any more questions for you while you're up there. I think I'm good for you. I do have, but if anybody else has questions specific for Jill while she's at the table, I'm happy to turn the floor and get it back.
Ms. Jacobson.
Just to follow up, thank you, Mr. Asa. If we don't have seat assignments for the first day of school, how would you be able to do that for the bus?
We have used the videos, and it's actually been pretty effective.
So you'll be using the tape from the buses in order to do that? Okay.
The tapes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Asa?
Okay. So this is going to be a question for the Transportation Department. But I am curious because one of the things we've talked about over time, and I feel this is an appropriate time to talk about this because we're talking about this policy, that we have talked about making routes more efficient and getting more kids on buses and ultimately trying to reduce the number of routes and reduce our transportation costs. And I'd like to know, obviously some of this was pre-pandemic, but how does this space available play into that? I'm curious to hear, are we getting to a threshold where we may be able to eliminate or collapse some routes if we were not to have a space available option here?
Good evening, everyone. So I just want to take a step back if I can for a minute. I'm new to transportation, as you all know.
Sorry, Mr. Papageorge, if you could just get really close to the mic. The only reason I say is that the people at home are texting some board members saying that they're having trouble hearing us, so thank you.
Is that a little better, hopefully? Okay, so being new to transportation, I reached out to Steve today and we went over some things. So it is my understanding that we offer the Courtesy Ride program, which is, the guidelines for the Courtesy Ride is that if a student or family member feel that there's a safety concern for a student who's designated as a walker, that name is turned over to our safety committee for transportation. They evaluate and they determine whether it is a safety concern or not. If it is a safety concern, we do find the available space for a courtesy ride. The other part of it is something that we've offered in the past, but we've never really had an official policy on, is the space available, which is a family calls and says they need a bus. They're within walking distance, but they need a bus because they leave for work before school starts, and if they are able to put their child on a bus, it would be available. They present a hardship, and we would, if there was space available, we would allow them to ride the bus. We still have the option with either of those in place to say yes or no to a rider. So if we have a bus route that's able to fold because we have less ridership and we're moving people around and putting people on different buses to cut costs, then that gives us the opportunity. We look at the space available, and we have the ability to say we do not have the space available because we were able to cut a bus. We're not looking to take that availability away to save the district money, but we are looking to listen to cases of safety and concerns, and when available, as the term space available is, if there is a empty seat on a bus that can be utilized by a student and the bus is already running and already in that area, we would offer the seat to them.
Okay, so to that point, with the previous transportation director, that was not the case. So with the previous transportation director, if you called and there was a seat, you didn't have to prove anything. You would just get the seat. I understand what you're talking about this past year because we've had COVID playing in, and as the chair of the Transportation Committee, I understand because those cases come to me. And this policy would not in any way affect, these changes here would not in any way affect that, and I would support that if there was a safety concern, that we still follow those procedures. What I'm getting at here is, and I'm also, my next question is, with everything going on, with routing, with potential changes in the COVID variants and numbers and everything else, what is the workload of the Transportation Department right now? You know, the director and his staff, and do they even have time in the next couple months to deal with this?
I think we're getting off course a little bit with this line of questioning for this policy.
Well, it's specific to the space available.
But just, I mean, some of...
I have these questions. They were not answered via email before the meeting, and I said that I would bring them up, and no one said that they wouldn't be answered.
Mr. Papageorge?
I can tell you that just like every year at the beginning of school, transportation is extremely stressed and overworked to get the routes done, the students on the buses. But we look at space available, and we've said already that we would not consider space available seating until we've figured out what the actual, not the number of students assigned to a bus, but the actual ridership on a bus is. And we've already said that that would not happen until first, second week in October at the earliest. We've actually had parents reach out to us already in regards to space available, and we have told them that it would be looked at, but not until once ridership is established, buses are established, and we're looking at first, second week in October at the earliest to start looking at that.
And if the space available request is denied by the Transportation Department, it ends there, correct? If there's not a safety issue, it would obviously, if it were a safety issue, it would go to the safety advisors. But if the Transportation Department denies it, that is the final ruling, correct? They're not going to then go to Mr. Cummings or to you to try and get it overridden, correct?
Well, I would believe that it would come to me as the executive director over transportation to have the final say as to whether a space available. And I would work with the transportation director to figure out what the best answer would be for the family.
Okay, and just the mere fact that you've openly admitted that you're brand new to this and having transportation with no experience, I appreciate that candidacy. I would just say that I think that we should table this policy and look at it again in the fall, and that's my stance on it.
Mr. Cummings, do you have something to add? And then Mrs. Massacanelli.
I do. I appreciate what Mr. Ace is raising around what I heard, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but the concerns about the work of the Transportation Department. And as Mr. Papageorge said, this would be something that we would get to. It's not the immediate priority. But with all due respect to Mr. Schneider and his staff, all of us have more work this year because of COVID. So if this is a return to something that he used to do, I recognize COVID imposes additional restrictions on all of us, and if he requires additional support, then his appropriate avenue to reach out is to Mr. Papageorge, and then we would have conversation about how we might be able to shift some staffing to him for a while, or help him with these particular requests. So whether the board decides to keep this or not, I just want to make sure that it will not be a workload issue for any of our staff.
And I appreciate that. The gist of my reasoning behind this is that if we're not going back to normalcy in the school buildings, and we're still quarantining, we're still contact tracing, why even open up the door unless it's a safety issue to adding more kids on the bus when Mr. Papa George already said that we're going to have overcrowded routes and we're going to hope that kids aren't on the buses? I realize some routes are less crowded, and I realize that the transportation department could make that determination. I just think it's premature to make all these other policies and enact all these mitigation strategies and then open up our bus routes.
Ms. Jacobson, then Mrs. Maxinelli. She had her hand up, Jen.
Just two follow-ups to Jill or Sands. I just wanted to ask a little bit, do you have any data on terms of the last year in terms of transmission on the buses? Did it happen a lot? Like, were we quarantining or isolating from the bus exposure at all last year? In any significant amount? That, if you know, I mean, you mean, you know.
We quarantined significant numbers of students on buses last year. I'm not aware of any case that there was, I am not aware of any case of transmission related to bus use.
Can repeat that
No
again.
confirmed transmission on a bus.
No transmission on the bus, but they were quarantined from the bus? Why would they be
That's right.
quarantined if there wasn't transmission?
Well, if
Oh, you
there
mean
was
they were saying they can't take the bus because they're not going to school?
No, no, no. If there was a positive kid on the bus and we would have to quarantine, let's say, 6 in that circle, I am not aware of any cases of transmission in any of those students who were quarantined.
Thank you for that answer. And then my other question is, this policy is going to expire September 30th. So if we're not doing this till October, is there a reason why we couldn't take this up at the September meeting? The situation, it sounds like we're trying to solve for a certain situation. Is it best to just put that situation in this policy as an amendment? Or do you just really, you're talking about special ed and the sibling. I mean, is that the situation we're trying to solve for here?
Personally, I wasn't trying to solve for any specific situation. And your point about the expiration date on these policies is a good one. But I think the idea was that if we had the opportunity to bring students back and by the end of the month, we can do so. If on September 30th the policy eclipses and we go back to our regular policy, then that policy takes over, and so be it. But it was really just to have it in front of us, around the timeline.
I hear both sides. I really do. I mean, this is like a judgment call because, if we're putting more kids on the bus that are not eligible for the bus, thereby increasing the utilization of that bus, thereby increasing the 6-foot radius to more kids being put in quarantine, which I'm not really happy about quarantine at all right now, then that is a concern. But I also know that there can be buses that are like empty, like half empty and have that space. So, I mean, I appreciate it's hard to solve that in this policy. But if we're, go ahead, sorry, go ahead.
Just to piggyback on Mrs. Jacobson, I would have no problem with leaving this policy the way it is now and just letting it expire in September. And if we had to bring it up again and make changes, someone like myself could make that request of the policy committee. Or if, so dictates, we extend it later on. But I just wanted to say that I would have no objection to that.
Mrs. Maxinelli?
Thank you. First, I do want to make clear to the board that courtesy rides absolutely are a part of the pre-COVID existing policy. So it has always been in our policy to have this as a formal offer to families and the public, and having no connection whatsoever to safety concerns or not. It was purely space available. It would help me out to get a ride. So that's always been a part of the policy. Regarding this in particular, I'll admit my thought always was, and again, because being more closely connected to high school more recently, we see those high school buses leaving with 5 kids on them. To be able to immediately, and that could be in the month of September, say, we've got a kid at the mile and 4/9 point, who would like to hop on a bus, and we can do that, and that helps that kid out and that family, and that kid undoubtedly who does not have a car or is a freshman, I just, to me, see this as a pure possible good thing. It bothered me. I completely understood and supported getting rid of it, but to bring it back for something like that, that said, I think this has been an invaluable reminder about the issues of quarantining and not wanting to overcrowd. I mean, for goodness sakes, we've had middle school buses with 70 kids on them. I don't think that because we go down to seat 68, we should be looking to fill those two. So what I would like to offer up to the board, because the one person who is most, feet on the ground handling all this and aware of our concerns would be Mr. Schneider. He's dealing with this every day. He knows these numbers, is that I would have suggested adding at the end of, this is on page B, at the end of the red language, at the discretion of the transportation director, just so that it is very clear that there is some discretion being involved, that it's not purely, it is space available to even open it up as a consideration, but that we are putting in the hands of one of our central office staff members the evaluation of, yes, a bus that went from 70 to 68 is not something that fits what this board or this community is interested in. A high school bus that has 5 kids on it, yes, and that I would trust it to the discretion of our transportation director. So I'd like to make a formal motion, and then we can have the discussion about it, to add at the end of after courtesy rides, changing the period to a comma, at the discretion of the transportation director, is the motion I'd like to make.
Can I have a second for that? Mr. Peterson?
And I believe I've already made the argument for it.
Anyone like to speak to that amendment? Ms. Vitale?
Yeah, I'm in favor of this amendment. I actually was going to say the same exact thing. I have no problem with offering courtesy rides right now. The only people I know who have ever used them have hardships. They needed those buses. The families needed those buses. And I think when we say space available, clearly it's at his discretion. So I would support this.
Mr. Asa?
I also just want to make a point, so the public doesn't think we're some callous district. Especially at the elementary level, from my knowledge, I don't think that it's often, if ever, that these requests are denied. They're often honored. And so I just want to make sure that that's out there, and I don't know if Mr. Papa George wants to confirm that, but it's very common for these requests to be granted.
Mr. Cummings?
I would confirm what Mr. Ace is saying. I think that the staff work really hard to not only Mr. Schneider and his staff, but the principals who get involved with these situations, teachers who get involved with this. I think people work really hard to eliminate any reason why a student isn't coming to school and to support their families.
Mr. Peterson?
I just want to say I'd be in favor of this amendment, and I might suggest to Mr. Cummings, one of the things when I was reading over the administrative regs on this, there's not a lot of phrases where where it references your discretion, administration discretion. So I would encourage you to add the discretion line in the edit that you have already planned here, just to make that more clear.
Can you clarify that? Because the amendment on the table speaks to adding, right, Mrs. Kennelly? It speaks to adding.
So next to page B on the facing page is the AR, the administrative regs. So I believe what Mr. Peterson is referencing is that word discretion get added there as well. We don't vote on that because they're the administrative regs, but I believe he's just suggesting adding that language.
Just for consistency and to highlight the point that it's a discretion of the administration has.
Okay, but the amendment is that it's the discretion of the transportation director, not the administration.
No, I think that the construction should be parallel, but I didn't want to tell Mr. Cummings how to write his own ARs.
Anyone else want to speak to the amendment? I appreciate the spirit that it was offered in. I will not be supporting this amendment. I think that It's not really needed. I think that Mr. Papageorge and Mr. Cummings would ultimately be overseeing this, and they are more closely in contact with the health department. We could be adding this, and we could be adding nobody if we have concerns about, quarantine and exposure on the bus. I think they're also more, in contact with families who might have a hardship, might have a need, and I would rather have the discretion be with them. So I will not be supporting this motion. We'll take it to the public. Any comments? Seeing none, we'll take it to the board. All in favor? Ms. Ritelli, Ms. Jacobson, Ms. Pitko, Mrs. Gerber, Mr. Asa, Mrs. Maxicanelli, Mr. Peterson, Ms. Guernsey. All opposed? Mrs. Vitale. Motion carries 8-1. Back to the main motion as amended. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll take it to the public. Any comments on the motion as amended? Seeing none, back to the board. All in favor? Ms. Ritelli, Ms. Jacobson, Ms. Pitko, Mrs. Gerber, Mr. Asa, Mrs. Maxicanelli, Mr. Peterson, Ms. Guernsey. All opposed? I'll be voting against just because I voted against the amendment. Motion carries 8-1. Moving on to policy C19.10, students with special health care needs. Can I have a motion to put this on the table? Mrs. Maxicanelli, a second. Ms. Guernsey?
This is another amendment, another policy that did not have language changes. I just want to address one point that came up in policy that I asked regarding, this is page F, because this was a minor source of contention with the previous policy committee. This whole issue of all lunches eaten in classrooms must be school prepared. We did decide in policy that we wanted to just leave the language untouched. Staff did not recommend we make any language changes. I did confirm that our staff was able last year to work with our cafeterias and whatever spaces they had, such that this language there on page F never actually needed to be implemented, but we did want to leave the language in just in case a new situation arose and that the staff had flexibility there.
Any questions? Take it to the public for any public comment on this. Seeing none, back to the board for a vote. All in favor? Ms. Ritelli, Ms. Pitko, Mrs. Gerber, Mrs. Vitale, Mr. Asa, Ms. Maxicanelli, Mr. Peterson, Ms. Guernsey. All opposed? Ms. Jacob, were you in favor? Okay, 9-0. Thank you. Deletion of policies. The recommended motion, the Board of Education delete policies, policy C19-3, Families First Coronavirus Response Act leave, and policy C19-11, school closing for emergency conditions. Can I have a motion? Ms. Maxicanelli, a second. Mrs. Gerber.
So just a word about these. The C19-3 policy expired anyway, so it's not even possible anyway, so 19.3 would make sense to get rid of. And C1911, this type of authority is not coming down to us from the state anyway, and so we were making a motion to delete this policy as well.
Any questions, comments? Seeing none, to the public for public comment. Seeing none, back to the board for a vote. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Approval of the CSDE authorized signature change form for the Bureau of Health, Nutrition, Family Services, and Adult Education. That the Board of Education approve the signature change form for the Bureau of Health, Nutrition, Family Services, and Adult Education per the enclosure. Can I have a motion? Ms. Pitko, seconded by Ms. Jacobson.
No, anybody who, if the board approves this, then anybody who has to sign it, just please don't leave so we can get it signed tonight. And can I just comment on the last policy deletion?
Yes.
Just to be really clear, it's a lot of technical language, but for the public, that means that snow days will be snow days this year.
Woo! And this is, the reason why we have to change this form is because Ms. Munsell has left us. And Courtney, are you here? Can you just come up and just introduce yourself? Welcome. Some of us have met you, but not everybody. And this way they can see who's going to be signing the form now.
All right. Oops. To hold it down. Oh, okay, thank you. My name is Courtney Laborious. I'm the new Executive Director of Finance and Business Operations. And I have a background in municipal finance that goes back to New York City as well as here in Connecticut. And I'm really excited to be joining you here in Fairfield and Mike and his team. So I wanted to thank you all, and I'm looking forward to working with you.
Thank you, and I apologize for not a formal introduction at the beginning of the meeting, but thank you for being here tonight, and welcome to Fairfield, and we will vote on this, and you can start signing. You'll be official. Any? I've seen her a couple times already. I feel like she's been here for like, it's like, oh, it's Courtney back there. Oh, wait, she's new. Any questions about this? Seeing none, take it to the public for a vote. Public comment. Seeing none, back to the board for a vote. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. Okay, superintendent's report.
Okay, I will give you an update on the soil testing, which is really not much at this point, as was discussed and shared. Essentially, the reasons for this soil testing is a follow-up to previously discovered issues and as part of the compliance with DEEP, the Connecticut DEEP, on what the town has to do to make sure that the remediation efforts actually took. So that testing was done last week. We have not yet gotten soil reports. As soon as we have that, we'll communicate it out to everyone, not just the schools that are currently impacted, and we'll post those testing results online on the recently revived field testing page. I've had the question, if this is it, are there going to be further testing? And I would ask that this is the extent of the knowledge we have at this point that's been shared with us. And the town also has a field testing site that I would encourage people to go to. So we'll see as this goes forward. But again, as soon as we have more information, we'll get it out and share it with everybody.
Any questions on the field testing? Okay. Seeing none, moving on. We did cover the update on remote learning options during quarantine. I don't know if you have anything else to say about that, Mr. Cummings?
No. We will have more information, and we'll get that out and share that not only with the board, but with the public. Okay. And before we have the motion to adjourn, just a reminder, our first regular meeting of the 2021-2022 school year is next Tuesday. So we are looking forward to seeing everybody then and welcoming the public back. And with that, have a good first day of school, everybody. Motion to adjourn. Mr. Peterson, seconded by Ms. Jacobson. All in favor? Motion carries 9-0. We are adjourned.